Welcome everyone to the 2021 Maryland State Firemen's Association's virtual conference and convention. I'm your facilitator for this session, Christopher Naum. Our program on this session is Fireground Operations on Main Street for Company and Command Officers. It's providing a high-level insight on some of the operational demands, both from a construction, operations, and risk standpoint. Our virtual online program is an abridged lecture from the full 8 and 12-hour seminar series. It provides a general overview of key insights related to the Main Street fires and buildings of Type 3 construction. This program was edited for online delivery and for the virtual program time. I'm your facilitator, Christopher Naum. For those of you that don't know me, I've been teaching nationally for over 35 years, over 40 plus years in the fire service in a variety of capacities, both from the company and command level to the training level, and also have worked as both an architect, a fire protection engineer, and a chief fire officer concurrently in various times throughout my career. Aside from that, you can take a look at some of the particulars relative to my background. But again, I've been actively engaged in the national arena for over 35 years, lecturing at all of the major conferences, regional programs, taught at the National Fire Academy, and also instruct and lecture on a global basis. Been actively involved with the, as a technical consultant, subject matter expert with the NIOSH Firefighter Fatality investigation program for the last 13 years, and have been actively involved in a number of different activities with agencies and organizations at the national level as a contributor. Some of the information that we have available to us in our short program here today is available on firehouse.com. There are some columns that I had written in past years. I wrote for Firehouse Magazine for over 20 plus years. Some of that information is currently still available in the archives. If you go to firehouse.com, you'll see some information specific to the predictability of building performance and buildings on fire. And then more specifically, as it relates to our program here today, a very robust number of columns dealing with collapse zone management, of which Type 3 certainly have a significant risk potential that's inherent to the building structures. Some of the other information that some of you may be seeking to obtain in addition to what you are going to get from our program here. Again, it's a short duration, high-level insight and overview. We've got much more material than time allows for, so again, we very well may jump around by intent and by design, make this more of a dynamic presentation based upon some of the commentary, either in the absence or in the use of our slides and visuals. Some of the information is available to you online, both on Buildings on Fire, our social media footprint on Buildings on Fire on the Facebook page, our Twitter account at Command Safety, at Buildings on Fire, also our Instagram on Buildings on Fire. We also have a continuing series of podcasts that we produce and deliver on fireengineering.com. If you go to the website and go to the Blog Talk Radio portion of it for the podcast, you'll actually find a number of archived programs that go back a number of years. We've actually been producing independently at first podcasts since the 2009, 2008 timeframe. So we've been on the early curves of podcast production and delivery, and you'll find a number of topical items, some of which we're going to make reference to in a minute. Would encourage you to keep track. Do follow us on the various social media sites. We do have an upcoming series on our Buildings on Fire, which is our main focal point. We do have the Anatomy of Building Construction, the ABCs, a lecture series with what we call our Fireground Architect webinars. We will be providing both webinar-based and podcasting, an entire series on building construction, and we will be rolling out a multiple duration series of programs discussing in greater detail buildings of Type 3 construction, Main Street, Type 4 for our mill, semi-mill, and heavy timber constructed buildings. So keep an eye on that. Go back to our social media. Again, like, follow, and do what you can do to provide some continuity with what we present. Our social media footprint in particular does quite a bit in the areas of reading the building. Again, trying to provide the necessary resources, insights, and information. We do a lot on lessons from the Fireground pertaining to historical events when they do come about, to continue to educate our current and emerging fire officers and commanders, provide them with the necessary insight for knowledge, skills, and ability development to really meet today's demanding Fireground. In addition, as I mentioned, we do have a number of additional programs that are available on our podcasts. Again, our Taking It to the Streets is our program on fireengineering.com. We do quite a bit of podcasting, rather in-depth and detailed in nature. But again, we do have two programs in particular that are archived. These are our multiple series programs. So we did one recently in 2020 on the row house fires. So again, dealing with type 3 row house and row frame buildings, multiple program series that are archived on there. And then also we just rolled out just recently within the last week, and actually last week specifically on our program on June 3rd, dealing with insights on brick and joist type 3s, the ABCs of building anatomy and construction, part 1 of at least a 3 or 4 part summer series. And again, podcast based, which will also supplement with our Zoom programs, which we'll get into some more detailed information here. So do follow us. A couple of other items of note here that are archived out that have relevancy to our conversation. Again, if you go back to the episode numbers are on your screen, and we talked about three specific events that are very pertinent, although we won't get into the details of them in our program here today. They do lend themselves to the rich level of additional knowledge and information and insights, especially if you're not familiar with these particular events. The North Division Street fire occurred in Buffalo, New York in 1988. 5 line of duty deaths of the first arriving aerial ladder that was blown across the street as a result of a building explosion in a type 3 manufacturing warehouse. We talked to the retired Chief of Department and former Commissioner Mike Lombardo, who was a newly minted firefighter and actually survived and operated at that event. The FDNY wall bombs fire, we did a 40th anniversary fire on that, along with our special guest, which was FDNY Deputy Chief Vinnie Dunn, retired out. So again, we really got into some very specific details on the wall bombs fire. Again, pertinent historical event that if you've never heard about this, we do have information on our various websites, on our firegroundleadership.com, our buildingsonfire.com, with a lot of visuals and so forth. But hearing about that event directly through Chief Vinnie Dunn's experiences and insights is phenomenal. And then lastly, a very important episode, which was the 23rd Street fire and collapse that occurred in 1966, 12 line of duty deaths, which was the largest line of duty deaths in a single event in the history of FDNY prior to 9/11. And Chief Dunn, again, provided a firsthand account of his involvement and what that eventually became as a stepping stone and a springboard to his entire career's level of engagement on building construction and why he began writing and so forth. But an exceptional, riveting story about the 23rd Street collapse and the insights firsthand from Chief Vinnie Dunn. A couple of other items of note here. When you take a look at a couple of reports that we're going to make reference to, the NIOSH report F 2012-13, April 9th, 2012, double line of duty death that occurred in the city of Philadelphia, the York Street fire and collapse. This particular event was significant. The loss of life of Lieutenant Robert Neary and firefighter Daniel Sweeney, who are operating on a ladder company. The report, I actually had the opportunity and the honor to work on that report in great detail over the course of almost a year and a half, 2-year period. The importance on this report from your standpoint is that there is a wealth of detailed information within that report that NIOSH allowed us the latitude to start writing about the issues of type 3 construction and type 3, type 4 construction, both heavy timber, ordinary frame construction, and talk about collapse zone management, many of the issues that had been silent for many years. So this is going back now 9 years in terms of its availability, but there are over 50 pages of detailed information and insights dealing with construction, collapse zone management, reading the building for a variety of generic-based conditions and then the applicability to this particular event. So I would encourage you to download this as a supplement resource item for your future referencing. A couple of other reports that should be on your radar screen: the double line of duty death from October 12th, 2015, F 2015-15, double line of duty death, Kansas City, Missouri, from a wall collapse. A mill building fire and collapse in York, Pennsylvania, F 2018-06, from February 22nd, 2018. Another one that's very, very pertinent and a tremendous degree of insight on type 3s, dealing with a row house fire, which resulted in a line of duty death of the first due lieutenant on his engine company, 2018-03, from January 6th, 2018, from Philadelphia. And then an informational document on workplace solutions from NIOSH, dealing with preventing deaths and injuries to firefighters by establishing collapse zone, which again is an adverse issue that's affecting the job and the service. So a couple of items there for referencing that I really encourage you to download. If you're not able to download those, let me know and I'll get you some of that information. A couple of other quick items of note here. Some of the information we'll be presenting in our program, again, on building facts, some modeling, some other considerations. For those of you that have an interest, email me and I'll send you some additional insights. We do have an informational document. It's called Building Facts on Type 3 Construction, sort of a primer on some general insights, some issues dealing with collapse zone benchmarking, time frame issues, some information on wall construction, and some other information on building performance that are part of our program. So again, I would encourage you to either email me or give me a phone call, however way you want to have that point of contact, to reach out, and we'll provide some information to help support your needs, whether it be now, in the upcoming next couple of weeks or months, or at some point in the future. This certainly should not be, and never is, a termination. Any of our activities that we've had, especially in person with our audiences and our classes as we lectured around the country, at our conferences, or on the individual departmental presentations or regional presentations for associations that we've provided, we always encourage our attendees to reach out for additional information, of which we have a tremendous amount of information and downloads that we can make available to you for not only this topic, but any of the issues dealing with building construction, operational insights. That really is our main focal point, which leads us into our conversation. And again, what's the big deal? Type 3 construction has been around for well over 150 to 200 years in many jurisdictions around the country. Nearly everyone has some type of Type 3 construction, whether it be one or two standalone buildings, or certainly some type of Main Street that are either remnants of what used to be a robust level of Main Street construction in your jurisdictions, or you may have an entire city area that has a mixture of Type 3s along with new construction over the decades of time. So it is a big deal, specifically because we typically do not study enough about this type of construction, the inherent issues associated with it, and the operational challenges. And what we call, again, when we take a look at the slide, it says buildings of ordinary and timber construction, old school hazards for today's buildings and risks. And that hits it right on the head. It's really been our prime focal point for many years that we've been teaching this around the road nationally and such, is that we recognize that the conversation on Type 3s and Type 4s really diminished and evaporated many years ago. And certainly when we saw, especially in the mid to late 1990s, and certainly over the last 20 years, very little conversation only of recent have some individuals and other colleagues of ours who have started talking about Main Street fires, talking about buildings of Type 3 construction. And again, we've been discussing this and presenting insights on it for well over 15 years. But again, it doesn't resonate for other organizations, especially when we see the degree of renovations and adaptive reuse in our buildings. These buildings that may have been laid vacant for many years, or have gone through a variety of adaptive reuses, now are suddenly back in the forefront with a variety of different occupancy usages and types, but we still have old buildings, old school hazards dealing with today's fires and risks. So again, it's a fundamental Main Street building type that has profound operational considerations on the Fireground that is commonly found in nearly all jurisdiction and response areas throughout the United States. But we, again, pay very little little attention to them, especially when we talk about compromise, collapse, predictability, performance, and operational items. They continue to be an evolving building issue in terms of our built environment. Our built environment continues to challenge us due to the variety of construction and inherent as well as hybrid types of buildings that are being constructed of this type of material, or any of them, and how they relate back to a very demanding fireground and operation. We talk about Main Street. Again, our Main Streets have been around for many, many years and decades of time. Have we paid attention to historical issues? Have we taken a look at the changes that have occurred in our jurisdiction, our response areas, as a result of these evolving changes, typically over decades and decades of time? The lifespan of these buildings continues to be pushed forward. As I mentioned, you very well may have some buildings that are at least 100 years of age, if not greater. Many of these buildings were built in the mid to late 1800s, some of them much earlier in the early 1800s. It was a common building construction type. It was common because of its materials and usages, and it even became more common based upon major precedences that occurred as a result of conflagrations and other events that occurred on a national level. These particular events, again, resulted in major changes from a regulatory standpoint that started requiring, especially in urbanized areas, the movement away from wood framing and truly the expansion of brick and joist construction due to the inherent fire resistive qualities, but also they did have, as a result of code changes, especially in the late 1800s, the origination of certain characteristics within the building that are inherent to potential collapses. Collapses were both internal, external collapses, and other issues. And if you're not aware of that inherent condition, then obviously you very well may be operating in a risk standpoint. When we take a look at our main streets, there's a variety of building types, both in terms of volumes and sizes, but many of them have a consistency in terms of the footprint. We read the Fireground. There's 4 different reads to our buildings and our Fireground. It's reading the Fireground, reading the building, reading the compartment and the fire and smoke, and then reading the companies. That's really a main focal point of our modeling that we continue to advocate and present nationally. But when we take a look at the Fireground and its relationship to exposures and other parameters around the built structure, or the built structure as either a standalone or collectively as part of a main street or block area, that again can expand upon in a variety of different blocks on either side, or the mixture of both new and old. But certainly the image that we see here of a common 2, 3, and 4-story type structures, very typically narrow in width, rather lengthy in depth, typically 25 feet in width, in that increment of 25 to 50, 75 to 100. The various bays and construction, and anywhere from 50 to 100 feet in depth are the common types of denominators relative to building footprint, which were all based upon size of construction and the variety of types of joists and wood material that went into our buildings. But when we take a look at the complexity of our buildings, again, we recognize that there's a variety of construction age and vintage. Many of these were built in the mid to late 1800s and right up and through the early 1900s. We can have both new and old type 3 construction. Just recognize that our current codes do allow for modern construction and materials utilizing masonry and wood. Typically the wood very well may be engineered structural systems along with masonry or stone types of perimeter walls, but that combination can be viewed upon as a standalone commercial building that's type 3 constructed based upon current codes built here in 2020, 21, or something that is more conventional when we talk about the historical issues of the traditional type 3s and really a truly legacy type of construction that we call heritage construction. All of the construction features of the 1800s, from 1800s to the latter part of the 1800s, is what we define as heritage construction. And if we can define it and give you the characteristics of that, then obviously we can train and develop and prepare accordingly from a strategic and tactical operational level, and also provide modeling. But again, when we take a look at the density levels, the kinds of things that may be common to a small type of location, or we expand upon that in something that's more complex. Again, our main streets encompass a variety of buildings built of brick and joist construction, our type 3s, type 4s, as well as what may be beyond the facades. So although it may look like an old building, the other questions that come into play is what's changed to that building relative to the interior renovations and alterations based upon the life cycle. Does it look like a type 3 Main Street building when in fact the interior has been gutted and we have all new or combined hybrid construction, engineered construction, type 2 construction, or a variety of other materials that have been added into that building? The variety of construction and materials that are present, again, there are characteristics based upon construction features, cornices, window treatments. All of these have different vintages. When we take a look at age, vintage, and era, there are variations that have occurred in different parts of the 1800s and even into the early 1900s that one can start identifying, developing a skill set on reading these buildings that will provide a wealth of information that certainly very well may influence your decision-making process in a command or tactical level. Other insights as we look at our buildings, again, there's a variety of different materials. It's not only modular types of brick materials, there's a variety of different types of stones, other masonry products that can go into the building. The narrower the window, the more aged or the longevity of that building, the older the building may be based upon the narrowness of these types of windows. Various types of treatments, very common relative to a 3-story structure. Either 2 or 3 stories were very, very common. And then again, in some areas, we'll end up going up to 4 or 5 stories. But typically our Main Street locations with our 2 stories. And again, the clues here, again, you may have a very narrow type building that's been infilled in there. Other features that have been covered over regarding the types of exterior treatments, or the fact that, again, if I take a look at this open lot here on the adjacent side, and again, we have got vinyl covering or other material that's been parged in there, what's changed to that building? Where are the original windows? We have what we call soft floors on the first floor levels that are normally higher in height based upon how they were built. Transom locations that are normally located or covered that also create voids within our buildings. But again, the issues dealing with perimeter walls, floor areas, roof areas, the compartment, those types of conditions, and the voids within the buildings are certainly very important. But this particular image of this building just shows us this empty parking lot that identifies this wall as a party wall. That was a wall that would have been shared with the building that at some point very well may have had a fire in it. But again, that building's structural systems relied on this common wall here to share the structural integrity. Now this becomes a very susceptible potential liability when we talk about risk potential of the building, the degree of fire involvement, and potential collapse considerations. But again, when we take a look at Main Street has a variety of features and conditions, many of which we are discussing and talking about here today. And again, especially when we look at these from an aerial standpoint, again, you can look at the level of depth and degree, consistencies, different types of roof configurations, all which give us different types of voids, different types of concealed areas, avenues for fire travel. And certainly when we talk about tactical approaches, again, there are some premises that one has to be given that you can expect relative to a fire within a compartment, fire within the building, and how that fire can certainly travel, and very often does travel beyond the building of origin or the room and contents of origin, and may very well affect multiple buildings, or certainly in many instances an entire block area of your Main Street, which is all consistent with those particular factors. Again, when we look at our buildings, there's consistencies with typically multiple occupancy type usages. Upper floor areas may have a variety of either residential single room occupancy or commercial type spaces. First floor areas normally are going to be present for retail and commercial space. The first floors are normally higher, anywhere from 12 to 15 to 18 feet in height, which are going to be dramatically different than the floor volumes in areas up above. And the reason being is that the transoms that you can see here that are covered over, these all represent large glassed areas that allowed for natural light to penetrate back deep into the recesses of these long buildings in a time in which, again, lighting was electricity had not been invented, gas lighting was being introduced, but normally there was some type of lighting that was done through gas lamping or other types of devices. So these transoms and how they were covered over in various standpoints, especially as we got into the latter part of the 1930s and 40s, and especially post-World War II, and even more so in the 1960s. All of these transoms became covered over, and a lot of facade changes became very prevalent to modernize our buildings. But as we look at a building, there's so many different elements. We talk about cornices. The question again is, can we recognize whether we have one building, which in this instance, this is one building with multiple bays. These pilasters that we see here, these external columns, and the single access doorway, again, leads us back into the upper location. So a single access stairwell, which allows access to the various 2 other floors up above. Significant concealed spaces up above. These cornices and parapets that we have can be very, very extensive. You can have a variety of either wood, masonry material, various other types of sheet metal, galvanized sheet metal, or coverings that have been added over on top of that the material. So you may not recognize or see the kinds of ornateness that is representative of a very well-kept building, but there may be a lot of coverages that occur. Building treatments in terms of windows, again, original windows that were narrow and high. Again, at some point in time, these windows were modified and changed. Many times as you go up closer to the building's perimeter walls and take a look at those windows, especially if you see aluminum mullions and such, it's certainly a good indication that the building has been renovated to some degree and may give you clues or cues relative to the degree of those changes. We can recognize here just in a one-shot image the air conditioning units that have been applied in the old buildings. So chances are these buildings have not been extensively renovated. In the upper floors, some window treatments have been modified and changed, but these air conditioning units in buildings that did not have inherent air conditioning that are present, but certainly these are going to be major concerns relative to isolated potential collapse points, especially if we have fire involvement in the upper floors, or the fact that they become loose relative to their secured positioning. Recent near miss that occurred in FDNY during the conduct of operations, an AC unit came out of an upper window location as a firefighter was working on one of the divisional alleyways and hit him squarely in the head. Injuring him, did not kill him, fortunately enough, but again, issues dealing with these types of items, canopied and marquees and overhangs and the kinds of conditions that are there, as well as the looseness of brick facades, the cornices and so forth. Just a lot of information when we talk about the kinds of details that are in these buildings, and we can go on at length just talking about the degree of information that these buildings have that demands of us to develop the skill set level to truly start understanding how these buildings are constructed and what goes into them, so that we can make the appropriate decisions, establish appropriate safeguards relative to the risk, and even more so, identify what the appropriate tactical windows are of operating in these buildings, of which there are very clear, definable tactical windows, benchmarks. They're different than PARs, but if you don't have a level of appreciation of when and how these buildings can collapse internally or externally, there's a variety of compromised collapse, internal, external to these buildings, along with a variety of materials and configurations, age, deterioration, environmental impacts that all affect our buildings as they exist. Fire escapes, canopies, renovations, and so forth. Again, we could go on. Just a great example down here of the importance of the 360, looking at different sides of the building. We take a look here, what used to be, again, a building structure, party wall versus a bearing wall. Bearing wall is normally a freestanding masonry wall of a particular type of thickness. It's independent of the other areas. Normally, we'll find a bearing wall that's perpendicular to the street level, so it's perpendicular to our street locations. But in this instance, this would have very likely have been a party wall that shared this wall with both occupancies on the divisions, the primary building, and then what would have been the exposure building on the Bravo side or number 3 side or division. Again, when we take a look at the other sides, this is being a street side location, we can see additional windows, common type of stepping of the parapet areas. And again, those parapets may have a variety of different types of capstones and other elements there that are capped to provide fire resistance and limit fire travel and extension from one side to the other. But again, these types of conditions and the stepping is indicative of a sloping type roof, normally from front to rear. In the south, you go into the deep south, it's just the opposite. Our type 3 buildings end up sloping from rear to front, and we'll typically find scuppers located in the front side that allow for roof drainage back into the street and the removal of water. Again, because of the commonality of environmental impacts in the South with torrential rains and so forth, there was just an opposite type of thing. So situational awareness, the aspects of our community, just understanding the degree of changes and being able to identify and pick up what those degree of changes are just by looking at perimeter walls. And perimeter walls are so important when we take a look at that level of detail and the information, and just identifying the skill set level to start being able to read the buildings. There are 5 predominant issues when we talk about reading the buildings. So looking at perimeter walls, identifying roof configurations and conditions, floor conditions, floor and or ceilings, but floor conditions, identifying, researching, and looking at building intel for that read relative to the compartment in terms of the overall resiliency, integrity, and time, and then identifying the presence or absence of voids and to what degree. Those are 5 critical factors that affect these buildings in particular. And then there's also 5 other elements when we talk about any of our buildings in our building construction series, but again, we'll hopefully provide some visuals here shortly. We talk about reading a building and taking a look at specific Fireground characteristics of our buildings. We'll relate this back to our type 3s here in our session, but it's also applicable to any of your buildings. Again, it's looking at the building anatomy, the structural systems, looking at the era and vintage based upon that building, when it was built. Sometimes, again, the telltale signs, either in a cornerstone or capstone, especially in these buildings, will tell you it was built in 1885, 1910, 1920, what have you. And that's important when we read the buildings, because depending upon the era and vintage in which it was built, that may also lead to certain considerations on the absence or the presence of fire cuts in our floor joists, the absence or presence of various types of reinforcing spreader plates, the types of window treatments, a whole variety of different elements, including wall thicknesses and other related architectural and engineering and construction features, even to the point of whether we had machine manufactured or handmade bricks. Again, age and vintage, cast iron metals, wrought iron metals. There's just a whole variety of different pieces here that we're introducing you to in terms of just the discussion points. And if this is the first time you're hearing about this, again, you can recognize that there's so much more to these buildings other than just a brick and joist, 3-story brick with fire on the number 3 floor, and we go to work. There is just so much layering of additional knowledge and information, building intel and characteristics. So I mentioned about building anatomy, era and vintage, and structural systems, the occupancy type and occupancy risks that are associated with it, of which there's a series of bullets that waterfall out of that. It's identifying the building's characteristics and performance criteria dealing with compromise and collapse potential, of which type 3s have a predominant high potential for an expectation that there's going to be internal or external collapses. They are designed and built, especially those buildings built after 1892, are highly prone to internal collapses based upon the fire cuts, the beveled end conditions of those floor joists that fail inward and really are designed to maintain the integrity, hopefully for the most part, of the perimeter walls. But again, we may have an isolated collapse, some brick treatments, you may have cornices or very elaborate elements of the building, you may have a quadrant or a bay of a building. This building has, again, here's the corner of the structure. We have 1, 2, we have 3 different bays here. And again, that represents the location of a beam and column system into that structure. And we'll talk a little bit more about the framing systems here in a moment. But again, all of our buildings exist as standalones. And the question becomes, again, what happens when we show up and we've got a structural fire? We can anticipate and do expect collapses to occur, both either isolated or catastrophic perimeter wall failures, roof failures, and the need to establish and maintain robust collapse zone management to keep personnel out of harm's way. But again, it goes back to understanding the characteristics, understanding the features, how the buildings are built, how they are prone to extensive fire exposure, and how that relates back to operational management on the Fireground. When we talk about our Main Street conditions, again, Main Street fires are pretty consistent. What we have in any given point in time of our main streets, again, very well may result in some type of fire that we hold to the building of origin, or very well may extend to a much larger footprint of the building, typically based upon the potential for fire extension, both in the cockloft areas of the roof perimeters, building to building exposure and extension, especially with deficiencies in party walls, or the openness of many of our renovated buildings, where again, it appears to have singular occupancy on the outside, but when in fact, again, we may have shared occupancies based upon wall areas that have been breached and opened up to create this open areas. In some instances, you may have boutiques and other types of Main Street facilities in which, again, the building's owner, these might be individual or collective occupancies run by one particular building. And again, you may have multiple tenant spaces that share an openness where individuals and consumers may be able to travel from unit to unit internally without any type of fire protection. Hopefully there's a sprinkler system that's been applied into that, or the other common issue deals with the presence of interconnected spaces, especially in the basement areas, basements and or cellars, sub-basements, and so forth. So that's going to be expected. One of the key elements here when we talk about insights from an operational standpoint is expect fire travel to occur within the primary building vertically and then horizontally based upon the cockloft areas up above and the roof lines, roof to roof areas, or again, auto exposure and vertical extension, or the issues dealing with extension from the various divisions on either side of the primary building. Great example here of the transom locations up above. Again, the likelihood of multiple voids being present as these large high ceilings were brought down in years past. We saw that in particular post-World War II, but as a result of the energy crisis in the 1970s, we really started seeing these 14, 15, 18-foot ceilings with multiple additional concealed ceilings being put in there that creates multiple concealed locations that again require us to open up these voids, especially if they're covered over with various types of treatments. So again, when we talk about challenges and operations, Main Street fires quickly can go from a single room and contents to a floor to a structural fire to multiple buildings fire, which end up really stressing and demanding for multiple alarms, mutual aid, greater alarm types of responses, and a timeliness of both response, operations, deployment, and trying to get ahead of that fire. And that's part of the challenge. The challenge, again, when we have mixed use construction and materials, both type 3, frame, row house frame construction, but type 3 in particular, where fire will rapidly expand and extend. Sometimes as soon as we're striking that alarm, if we don't have pre-established multiple alarm capabilities, then again, we're going to be operating deficiently and behind the 8 ball. Timeliness of response is so critical when we talk about operations in the Fireground, which makes all of the difference between a successful save of one building or trying to save an entire city block when we may very well end up having almost conflagration related conditions. Front and rear of structures, old and new, a variety of types of conditions, and certainly the aspects of collapse, isolated, catastrophic failure of single unit structures while still maintaining the integrity of the building. So collapse is a big to-do, and especially when we talk about fire severity and fire extension of those operations. And again, the importance of what we may have present on the street side of street division and what more often than not might be present in terms of fire origination in the rear division of the structure. So it's very, very important in terms of accessibility during our 360, information, building intel, the complexity of fire extension, which should always be anticipated from one particular occupancy and tenant space to the other. And this is especially true when we talk about taxpayers, those single story type structures or 1 and 2 story type structures, where again, the commonality of voids and presence of those conditions will certainly allow the potential for, and in most instances does result in fire extension and a horizontal standpoint into the other divisions of our structure. So again, you've got to be able to get in and understand our buildings. If you're going to command or tactically engage in a structural fire, you better understand the building. There's limited margin for error on today's evolving Fireground, and errors and omissions are unforgiven when we talk about our fires and operations. You need to understand the buildings as they exist and hopefully have some insights before you show up and have a job in fire, especially under the risk standpoint of civilians in distress. There's very little opportunity for recovery. In other situations and instances, again, we talk about occupancy risk. This was a fire that occurred in again, a type 3 constructed building. This is just a Google shot of the front end of the building. But again, pretty narrow when we talk about a 50-foot, about 50 foot across, but very deep in terms of its depth, almost an entire city block in length, about 150 or more feet in depth. But again, when we talk about the resulting issues of occupancy risk, fire loading, megawatts of energy, heat release rates, again, It doesn't take much. So we just take a look at this quick image here of a very rapidly developing fire occurred in Los Angeles City, significantly injuring. If you watch it, the firefighters that are trying to evacuate the roof, going through extensive high temperature plumes that the only way down is through that ladder, other than not trying to jump off the ladder. But those firefighters went through that plume within that short duration of exposure, sustaining very, very serious injuries. Fortunately, there were no firefighter deaths. Just take a look at the exhaust plume on the rear of the building in the division on the other side of the structure, which would be our number 3 division. So again, we'll have another aerial drone here, a shot of this in a moment. And again, this is occurring during the conduct of concurrent operations. Ladder companies going to work. Engine companies are operating down below. We can see the exhaust conditions, vent paths, both on the number 1 division, the rear division, number 3 division. But look at the fire intensity relative to the number 3 division and our firefighters coming down off that roof in such a pronounced immediate standpoint due to the rapidly deteriorating conditions that were unexpected. So again, these are bread and butter operations, but it's much more than stretching the line. So just be cognizant and aware of fire loading issues that affect our buildings and our operations. It has to be much more than stretching the line. Sometimes, again, our buildings are cosmetically designed to look like old buildings. This is actually all new construction, when in fact it has all of the appearance from a classical standpoint of what appears to be old construction of our buildings. Entirely different than, again, an inherent building of construction from late 1800s versus something that was built in 2018. So again, many times we'll find a combination of various types of engineered structural material within the newer types of buildings that are going to react differently under fire conditions. But at the same time, if we have an appreciation of how the buildings were built, we can go to work and do our job. So regarding certain other potential risks of building profiles, roof configuration, bowstring, trusses, and so forth, it's really important just to understand the building's anatomy, understand construction features, and have the experience and proficiencies and skill set level to be able to conduct operations in the least amount of time. So it goes back to, if I've got a highly proficient company, yes, I can do certain things within these buildings within a limited tactical window and conduct our operations and hopefully save those individuals that are in distress or are at risk, and put the fire out. But again, there's a lot of moving parts in order to achieve and get to that level of operations. The importance of construction and being a student of construction cannot be understated. And again, many of these buildings have existed for decades, if not centuries of time. And at some point, again, that building that had been built at some point in the late early 1900s continues to be present today. And these buildings at some point, again, evolve into some type of fire with a level of intensity that may grow to a substantial challenging conditions that more often than not very well may lead to multiple alarm fires with significant risk of compromise and collapse to our buildings. Unlike residential structures that have some limiting conditions, again, it's all about understanding the compartment, understanding the fire, understanding perimeter walls, roof configurations, resiliency, integrity, and time that come about as a result of building features, and being able to, again, correlate that back into the operational standpoint of being able to go to work. Having proficient companies and the variety of standpoints and be able to do that job in a predetermined standpoint relative to riding positions or building risks that you've pre-planned out, looking at building intel and understanding what has gone into that building over the extended period of times and how that building has evolved into other features and conditions of our structure. Many other times when we take a look at our buildings, they evolve in a manner that, again, we are just not expecting. Couple of key elements here when we take a look at the 5-star model. I mentioned this a couple of times over in the beginning of our session. When we take a look at any of our buildings, taking a look at what we call the 5-star model, looking at construction systems and anatomy, understanding the inherent configurations, conditions, looking at occupancy type and occupancy risk, compromise and collapse characteristics, the methods and materials of construction that, again, are indicative of era and vintage, and then identifying the fire dynamics within the buildings. These are 5 primary elements that are modeled after consistencies of engineering, architecture, and firefighting. And one of the things that should be a takeaway for many of you is that you can start looking at your buildings regarding these 5 particular elements, identify some of the other elements with our acronym of BEAR, building anatomy, era and vintage, and then those risk considerations, again, based upon when they were built, that era of time, what particular decade or number of years will give us. There's actually a series of waterfall bullets that if I look at a building built prior to 1865, these are the considerations of it. If I have buildings that were built after 1892 and the capstone cornerstones shows that it's being at 1890 and so forth, or 1899, we know that that building is going to have a beveled fire cut that's going to be located in there. It's going to have perimeter walls that have various types of spreader plates that are going to be located in there. If it was built after 1915, there are other additional things that went into the construction of that building based upon the emergence of the National Building Code, that it was published early in 1901, but again, wasn't fully integrated nationally until 1915. If we understand when these buildings, the era and vintage of them, there's going to be building characteristics that we can get into that, again, identify different reads of the building that give us insights relative to suggested considerations for our decision making. The other aspects is the acronym of RIT, dealing with resiliency, resistance, integrity, and time. And it's all about understanding the resiliency, integrity, and the time factors in terms of fireground operations of our perimeter walls, of our compartments, of our floor areas, of our roof systems, and especially in these building types, because it'll give us our tactical benchmarking in terms of how much time we have to operate. I'll say this up front here. Again, our buildings, if you're operating for any length of time in a building and have not made significant progress relative to fire control, and if you're operating anywhere near that 30-minute duration of time from time of arrival, you are highly susceptible to a catastrophic failure of that floor and or roof or wall systems. That building will fail, and they commonly start failing earlier than that 30 minutes, but 30 minutes going beyond that, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And more often than not, we've seen time and time again, failures occur in the 32, 35-minute time frame, or certainly much earlier. We talk about benchmarking. Many of you still may be utilizing a 20-minute fireground rule, which is still very, very antiquated. We don't have the ability to get into that level of detail, but we should be looking at a benchmark of a 10-minute fireground tactical window of operation, monitoring those conditions as we approach that 10-minute mark, and then determining success or potential changes in terms of a benchmark point of what's our success path, what's our progress, reading the building, looking at these 5 particular elements, looking at resilience, integrity, and time relative to the age and vintage of it, also based upon the fire severity, the urgency, and the growth. So there's a couple of moving parts here that truly affect the aspects of our building. When we talk about fireground operations, those considerations of Main Street fires, they relate back to the building, its predictable characteristics. And again, it's not something you're going to get in a 60-minute session. It's not something you're going to get in just a small duration type seminar. It does require a very in-depth immersion in the topical area. And again, just an 8-hour immersion of that into some very detailed level of conversation, discussion on construction and various aspects of the predictability of these buildings based upon size and footprint. So they're not all the same. And they all start again with that single size, either standalone or multiple buildings that might be part of a taxpayer row or a series in a block area that starts with that individual building. Again, that 25 by 100 or 25 by 75 foot depth, typically a 2 or 3 story structure, and then building upon the characteristics that come out of this modeling that give us the potential for tactics and operations. I can have a standalone building. I can have one that has party walls, bearing walls. I can have a series of buildings, all that, again, have age, deterioration, and other considerations, all with inherent predictable avenues for fire travel that have to be considered during our size up and during the conduct of our operations. So resiliency, integrity, and time is another concept to introduce you to it. And then also severity, urgency, and growth. Do we have concurrent or do we have sequential potentials here for severity and growth and time factors? So it goes back to criticality of time, criticality and severity, urgency, and growth, and being able to predict and identify where fire is progressing to. And then it ultimately goes back to the 3 elements here: understanding the building, understanding the compartment, understanding our companies. And again, if there are deficiencies in our companies, if there are efficiencies or deficiencies, capability limitations, staffing levels, am I running with a 2-person staff company, 3 or 4? And again, what are the capabilities? Do I have a whole company that's comprised of senior firefighters, or do I have a bunch of newbies and recruits and probationary firefighters along with a couple of senior members? So again, it goes back to capabilities. And again, there is not a lot of time to mess around at these particular fires. It demands very, very prompt, aggressive movement of hose lines, getting into the building, trying to get control of that fire, opening up, concurrent opening up the voids and conditions. If very, very effective and highly integrated truck company work, getting up inside the building in a collective manner, working with our engine companies, opening up and having water availability to provide control and or suppression and mitigation. But there's such a high degree of emphasis on coordinated attack, coordinated activities that go well beyond the suppression and mitigation and control. Then we get into, again, just the aspect of tactical mobility, the availability and the accessibility of personnel to get into the building, movement into the structure, vertical, and so forth. Do we have the availability of personnel for our primary search and rescues, or conducting multiple floor primary search and rescues while this fire may take hold of a single access point, the availability of other alternative means of egress, the presence or absence of fire escapes. Again, there's just a lot here relative to firefighter survivability, occupant survivability, safe areas of refuge. And again, when we talk about resiliency, integrity, and time, these fires are affecting the inherent characteristics of old building construction and materials. They are also going to be multiplying the impact of the effect of new construction in the shell of old construction. So again, it may look like an old building on the outside, but what's happening on the inside, what's been renovated. Again, just a great example of the soft floor. This used to be a very predominant, very significant high transom locations, all been covered over. Single point access location to get to the upper floors. Very, very elaborate wood cornice, very elaborate type of parapet we see here with the treatment of a cornice conditions, both brick as well as wood. So just a lot of different moving parts here when we talk about those particular aspects and how they affect us operationally, tactically, even to the point of reading the building. Reading our buildings, again, when we just talk about some basic elements here, we have a variety of structures that are located within a particular geographical area, more commonly some type of a city or metropolitan or built area block. So again, for some of you in our rural sections, again, your downtown Main Street may be just the four corners, a couple of stoplights, or again, this may be part of a very robust, very complex, intermixed type of buildings from different age and vintages, all that have susceptibility and risk. When we take a look at this series of buildings here, again, they all have some commonalities in terms of width and depth, corner type buildings, different type of roof configurations, square footages, the footprint, construction. Do we have the presence of bearing walls, party walls? This used to be an old firehouse. It's located in there, what used to be a building that's now an open parking lot locations, highly susceptible areas. This obviously is a bearing wall because of the presence of windows, extensive window treatments on any of the perimeter walls is normally indicative of some type of a framing system that may be located in there. Mill type construction, or heavy timber type construction, just in terms of the footprint of the building, both in terms of vertical size as well as the types of bay areas. Again, just these pilasters are indicative of bays locating both vertical and horizontal column and beam assemblies. But understanding our buildings, having pre-incident knowledge, getting out into the streets, looking at your structures is so important. When we talk about operational perspective of our buildings, there are going to be some common elements of treatment when we talk about looking at our buildings, or the common types of 2-3-story structures, the various usages and occupancy, usage and occupancy risk, the modification, the changes, things that are inherent to the buildings and characteristics of that structure that, again, we've alluded to and provided some insights on. When we take a look at each type of building, each building represents, again, a unique set of parameters relative to predictability. Looking at materials and methods of construction, are there commonalities relative to when they were built? Are there shared differences or unique differences based upon size and footprint? So size, footprint, square footage, volume, and occupancy usage also gives us occupancy risk potential. But each one of these buildings, either collectively or combined, this building here, based upon construction and features, again, may represent one building or may represent two buildings that share, in this instance, they do share a common party wall. This wall here very well may be a brick bearing wall, just because of the difference in size of the adjacent structure. And again, other aspects here. This one very well may be one structure with a party wall, but again, we take a look at the continuation or continuity of the brick treatment at the cornice area. Again, sometimes just the change in brick color or the painting of brick, but again, I'm seeing some similarities and or differences. So you've got to take a look at each one of the building's configurations, conditions separately, individually, and then just make that combination of treatments based upon where that fire may be located and its level of intensity. So again, it all goes back to fire origination. Do I have a room and contents fire? Is that isolated? Again, based upon my arrival, what type of control measures? Do my 360 and 180, get building intel. Sometimes, again, if I can't do the 360, just get into the adjacent structure, go from front to rear and get some eyes on the rear of the structure to identify, do I have auto extension? Do I have other deterioration? The most critical part here too is that the front of the building may have a very likable type of an appearance in terms of the facade treatments or the updates, because of, again, it's public side of it. But again, when we go to the rear of the building more often than not will tell us how badly deteriorated or the true characteristics, condition of that building. Can't tell you how many times in the past where front of the building looks immaculate, very nice, very open, very inviting in terms of public treatment, especially on the commercial side of it. Go to the back of the building and it looks like it's ready to fall down. So again, the importance of doing that 360, and again, the importance of understanding, do I have open or closed structures and so forth. But again, fire within the compartment, its location, its severity and risk can quickly go from a room and contents to a fire within the floor area. That fire in the floor area and its potential extension will start affecting building integrity issues. And the rapid extension of fire in these buildings has to be anticipated, both vertical as well as our horizontal extension. Fire into the hallway areas that are common, protected, unprotected conditions, especially when I have multiple occupancy types of usages in these upper floors and commercial tenant spaces in the lower floor areas. So now we have multiple floors that are potentially going to be involved in some degree of fire severity that very well may lead to a building fire. Now, when I have the building fire, now I start having to worry about fire extension and exposure into the other different exposure divisions. So again, can I go one side to the other, anticipate it going either way, have a robust plan in place, start calling for robust levels of resources, get them on deck, get them staged out so that they are available when needed. Worst thing is when I've got fire that's now, extended from its area of origin, and it's going to be rapidly extending. And again, the avenue of extension is going to be very common. Once I have conditions, especially on top floor fires, you can certainly expect fire travel to occur horizontally into the adjacent exposures. And again, you will be challenged at best relative to truck company work, getting those aerials in place, establishing and positioning them with an anticipation of potential collapse. So again, just be aware that these buildings are going to be prone and will collapse, possibly before you mitigate and control that fire. So apparatus placement, the establishment and controlling of potential or anticipated collapse zones, and then the rigor of establishing and maintaining collapse zones during the conduct of operations is very, very critical. But just again, just anticipate that fire extension, that fire travel, the considerations relative to the exposure divisions, plan accordingly, set up your incident command, have the appropriate depth from a command standpoint, anticipate that extension into a variety of other exposures and conditions. So again, these are just basic tactical approaches that when you gain that kind of experience, you can expect that to occur based upon sizing and reading that building during the transfer of command from a company to a command officer, the BC or deputy or divisional chiefs, or as the incident escalates, and again, we get into a multiple alarm condition. Again, there is going to be size up that's going to occur at the initial arrival by the company officer, a command size up that's going to be initiated by the commanding officer's arrival. Again, is it visual? Is it something that's communicated verbally? Are there going to be additional building intel information that's going to be gathered and put into place? But again, as that severity increases, fire intensity, that severity, urgency, and growth, and the biggest issues is just anticipating where that fire is traveling. How is it traveling in that horizontal plane, and the severity of what's occurring vertically into the other compartments within that particular structure. Do not, again, forget about the basements and cellars within the buildings, especially when we have fires that are being located in those lower levels, storage areas, again, shared conditions that might have various types of walls that have been removed that are individual compartments, or sometimes, again, if that building owner has taken over this entire building's block, you very well may have commonality, common spaces that, again, have opened up the basement that provide support for the occupancies up above as storage space and are highly prone to additional fire loading and the intensity levels of the fire load packages, and then how that plays out relative to basement cellar fires, the demands associated with operations within them, limited access points, gallon per minute sustainability and fire flow. So just don't underestimate fire originating within that building, fire extension in the various directions within that structure, and how fire can quickly move from a room and contents to a building, to multiple buildings, to the entire block area or others. So when we establish our considerations, initial collapse zone management of a primary location, and then have that modularly considered, we talk about establishing multiple collapse zones around the perimeter of that particular structure. And again, doing so in terms of a precursor or establishing them very early on so that you're able to establish and then manage and control them throughout the advent of the operation. The other critical aspect here is when we talk about the radiant heat exposure, both radiant heat and how that's going to play out based upon intensity levels throughout the perimeters of the buildings. And then again, it's not only the radiant heat consideration, but also any of the smoke and flame and ember plumes that are going to originate, and how they very well may start challenging what started off to be room and contents building fire to a multiple alarm fire that now may require resources well beyond the area of origin. So again, anticipation of the potential for other fires across the street or down the road from that building. So again, resources, command, organization, and structuring to be able to deal with our buildings, because again, as these buildings exist, there is so much potential for them to turn into something much more. And that much more, just as we looked at in this series of buildings and conditions, starts off in a particular location, quickly extends, gets into a multiple alarm fire, which again has civilians in distress, that just requires a lengthy course of operation that demands quite a bit of companies at the tactical level and at the command level. So again, upon our arrival, anticipate in terms of fire severity, the urgency, and the potential growth of where that fire will go potentially in the operations. Let's just want to, so a couple of items here. Again, we're our limited time opportunity here. We don't want to get into too much of an extension of beyond our window. We take a look at our building anatomy, our construction systems. We talked about, again, there can be ordinary type 3 construction, heavy timber, mill, semi-mill construction, mixed vintages of construction, both conventional, engineered systems that may be present within the structure. So just be aware that that mixture of material construction conditions all have varying levels of resiliency, integrity, and time. I mentioned some of the influencing factors when we talked about bearing wall, non-bearing wall construction, party walls. We can have unreinforced masonry as well as reinforced masonry. Again, common elements of these buildings from the 1850s all the way to the 1960s. Facade considerations, basement, cock lofts, fire zones, old law, new law, tenement, and the factors and influence of the National Bureau of the National Building Code that occurred in 1915. Again, 1879, 1901, actually 1892, 1901, 1915. These are all critical elements that we would get into some further details and conversations based upon when the building was built, characteristics that are present within these buildings, and the need to identify them relative to the construction, the types of vintages, floor conditions, anatomy, just understanding, again, some aspects here that give us some building intel just in terms of the age of the buildings and other factors as we get into, again, identifying the criticality of construction systems, bearing wall, party wall, masonry construction, infill, non-bearing wall, the enclosures, the era and vintage, and the most important element we'll talk about, the building footprint and its layout. These are important when we talk about them from an operational standpoint. Do we have a hybrid? Are there inherent, innate elements of the buildings, the mixed configurations, the vintage, and the engineered structures that go into our building? Footprint and layout, one of the things that we've developed is this informational item on our building facts. Some of you may be familiar with our concepts of first arrive in construction, tactics, and safety. It forms the basis of what our conversations are in a variety of building types and occupancy risks. But one of the things that we've put together based upon the commonality of a footprint of a building, again, based upon the unit of measure of 25 feet by, again, 50, 75 to 100. Again, when I have a larger building, it still has a basis of that 25 to 30 foot module and the likelihood of additional beams and columns being present. One of the things that we put together here in this diagram just takes a look at floor areas, as well as the footprint, as well as the multiple sizes of the building relative to square footages and relative to what we consider to be 50% fire involvement. And again, it moves us from a green area to a red area in terms of being able to have a go or no go types of situation. Don't have the time to elaborate on this in greater detail. If you're looking for some further insights on that, again, just send me an email and we'll make some of that information readily available and accessible to you. In the interest of our time, and again, we have, I'm just looking at the number of slides here that we have available to us that we will not be able to get to. Let me just talk a little bit about some specifics, about 5 or 6 slides here to wrap up our discussion point. When we take a look at our buildings, and this is just a cursory overview of some key elements of features. So predominantly, again, we have multiple occupancies, both residential or mixed occupancy types of units. Multiple occupancies may be very common to our buildings in the upper floor areas, commercial and retail on what we call the soft floor locations of our building, commercial at street level, and some type of residential and or mixed usage on the upper floors. We may have full use occupancy that may be present in the building. There may be street level vacancy. There may be upper floors that may be occupied. So although there may be vacancies in the first floor, there may be various types of occupancy usages on the upper floors. So again, that's inclusive of a full use and vacant, unoccupied, derelict, or abandoned. But again, what those decision points are based upon what is perceived, what is actual, what is predicted, what is factual, and so forth. Configurations, conditions, again, just a great example of a mixed configurations of facades, some that have been modernized, but again, beyond that facade, there exists and is present an old building. Typical type 3 features, 1 to 3 stories. Generally, in most jurisdictions, you'll find that 1 to 2 story type of taxpayer structure, especially in our retail commercial districts. Very common with 1 to 3 story structures, and then they can include all the way up to 5 stories in height. Typically, our taxpayers 1 to 2. Common for our street, block, and urbanized areas, and then some type of multiples of 25 foot by widths by 50 to 100 foot depths or larger. So although that's the common, it could certainly be very larger. The larger the footprint, the more likely you will find multiple columns and beam assemblies that are present within the building that now creates another series of structures. It goes beyond type 3 and starts moving toward type 4. So we end up having heavier timber type of construction that's much different. Typical types of tenements are 5-story structures, age and era determinate. Again, well over commonly the average of 100 plus years, all the way up to 150 plus years of age. Our typical type 4s are 5- and 6-story type structures, well over between 100 and 150 average years of age. And again, the anticipation is the fact is that these buildings have undergone some degree of renovation or alterations in that lifespan of it. It's just a given. And you will very unlikely find a building that has undergone limited to negligible changes in 100 plus years. And those conditions may vary. And if you do find a pristine building, again, those conditions can vary from derelict to very high risk to a mixture of conditions within the structure. Other aspects here, when we talk about predictability, performance, the buildings are old. And that should be a discussion point in itself. Typically masonry, stone, brick, tile, and concrete construction, fully dimensioned lumber and timber that are going to be present within the building. Designed for and highly prone to collapse. Internal, external compromise and collapse zones, inherent design features of which we've introduced a few elements, compression and mass reliant relative to loads and spans. Age-related deficiencies are fire cut, angled, pocketed, restrained, or anchored. And again, unreinforced or reinforced masonry type construction. These deficiencies, again, have a predictability of fire travel, fire risk. The fire load packages can be expected to be high, which again, what does that mean? Well, now I've got to have sustainability of my gallon per minute flow rates. And again, it's going to influence what type of line size, what kind of manpower and resources I may have available, what's going to be the immediacy and the need to have maybe a more robust assignment being called upon to handle what appears to be a controllable fire, but what happens in the next 5 to 10 minutes in that benchmark. Again, you don't want to be behind the 8 ball for that. And again, the aspects of mixed occupancy usage is highly probable. Combustible structural systems, cast iron, wrought iron, steel supports, and treatments within the buildings. Our roof cornices, our parapets, the architectural treatments, both brick, stone, terracotta, and other. The aspects that we do have concealed spaces may be multiple, both vertical and horizontal. Compartments, spaces, floors may be interconnected or shortened, vertical and or horizontal. The presence of fire escapes, combustible decks and porches. Again, a common feature, especially in our entertainment venues, is creating these outdoor patios, especially on top of roof areas, that not only increase fire loading, but the live and dead loads of conditions in there that are going to be present. Dead loads dealing with canopies, marquees, water towers, or their remnants, billboards, and signs, and then the introduction of engineered structural systems in the adaptive reuse or renovations of those structures. Be aware that the storefronts, especially on the first floor, create what's called a soft floor, the transoms that are going to be present, glass block, again, high volume typical floor areas that may have concealed spaces. Again, considerations dealing with building, the resiliency, the integrity, variables, compartment issues dealing with resistance, integrity, connectivity in terms of connections, vertical and horizontal. Company capabilities, again, resources, pre-planned knowledge, skills, and abilities. Get out into your streets. One of the things that we do commonly in our national programs, when available, we've done this in New York City. A good friend of mine, Chief Danny Sheraton, that you may know of, FDNY Battalion Chief in the 3rd Division in the Bronx. We actually conducted a street level tour in Lower Manhattan. We started off in Midtown Manhattan. We did this in November or actually in December of 2019. We did a 12-hour walking tour of Manhattan, from Midtown Manhattan all the way down to ground zero, just looking at buildings, reading the buildings, talking about tactics, operations, and just really 3-dimensional considerations. We've also offered this similar type of building construction classes nationally at both Firehouse Expo and Firehouse World. I do offer these as an independent type of the either departmental or regional based type of program, where again, we start off in the classroom, do a classroom session on the particulars of a building, then go out in the streets, do a walking tour. And what better way to learn about our buildings, again, just walking through the alleyways, street areas, looking at our buildings and so forth. So just keep an eye out on our various websites and social media, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic here. We very well may be starting to offer some of these on a limited basis. Either in Baltimore, we did, again, a number of them when Firehouse Expo was in Baltimore, street walks around a 12-15 block area in Baltimore. Depending upon considerations, we may do a couple of these in upstate. We're also trying very hard to maybe provide another New York City walking tour in the fall area that coincides with 9/11, shortly thereafter, or sometime in October. So these are limited capacity types of tours, normally 25 to 30 participants, again, lecture, and then multiple hour tours of looking at buildings, just looking at the elements there that more than likely are going to be present in your particular response area. So again, capabilities. If you're not studying the stuff in the classroom, get out, get your companies. You guys that are company officers, get your companies out and start looking at the buildings and starting to identify some items here. And those things that you don't recognize and you can't find the information in the reference books that's typical that you're not, send me an email and I'll help fill in the blanks in there. Tactics: be aware of an adaptive fireground management model relative to fire suppression, time to manage the benchmarking. Again, be prepared for master stream fire flows that, again, will also impact or disrupt and affect structural stability. Be aware of the basement, cock loss of variables, unconventional issues that may affect operations. Placement of apparatus in terms of potential building compromise, the establishment of collapse zone, external caution during overhaul stages, anticipate escalating fire severity and multiple alarm risks, various types and categories and precursors in terms of sizing up the building, especially from collapse and compromise, delayed fire suppression and engagement, which may result in may highly influence, again, building performance and integrity. And then lastly, adaptive reuse renovations. It may look old on the outside, but again, a lot of modern construction that very well may be present within the inside of the structure that demands a more adaptive tactical approach and operations. We talked a little bit about our heritage, vintage heritage constructions. Pre-1900s is primarily the 1800s to the 1870s, relates back to pre and old law. Our legacy, we call legacy construction, is our buildings from 1900s to the 1940, 1949 era. And again, just some of the configurations. Again, just in terms of wall areas, about a 4-foot increase in thickness of a wall for every 35 foot of increases. So once we get past 33 stories in height, the walls will start increasing in width on the lower floors and become smaller up above. So just a couple of different elements here: size, volume, complexity, occupancy usages. For those of you that have an interest in these series, there's about 15 slides here that gets into this level of detail. Again, we do have that in a PDF format. That's sort of a high-level review of some of the discussion points that we've provided here in our class. The elements dealing with vent paths, flow paths, connectivity, cock loft issues, the transom and concealed spaces and so forth, and those presents, urgency of operations and fire severity, collapse zone management, some time configurations, and so forth. So again, we've sort of reached the termination of our program here. Again, when we just take a look at our previous slides, again, it's all about preparation, pre-fire planning, knowledge, skills, and abilities, tactical insight, command intelligence, and adaptive fireground management perspective that we elaborate and get into much greater degree on. Understanding of fire flows, and more importantly, just having a greater degree of appreciation on the benchmarking and operational time frame in terms of our tactile windows in these buildings, and then just understanding the building, the compartment, and that company. And again, just inherently understanding those risks of these buildings, because we truly are operating within the kill zone, and those challenges of again, just understanding the buildings, the configurations, and those conditions relative to our operations. Again, I'm just looking at some of the other material here. So again, I'll just leave you with this. You know, clearly, again, I've been professing and advocating, you've got to understand your buildings. You've got to get out into the streets, get those companies out there, start reading and looking at your buildings, and start developing that level of insight. If you don't have that insight, again, start asking the questions for those of us that are out here to help gain that information. Understand the differences based upon the environmental stressors, time of year, again, whether it be summer or winter, and how those buildings will operate differently, and also those considerations of environmental distressors, and also the issues dealing with daytime and nighttime. You can pre-fire plan, get your companies out both in the daytime, but then also take a look at those same buildings during the nighttime operations. The cloak of darkness will create an entirely different set of parameters, and more than likely will increase the risk on things that you cannot see regarding perimeter walls and fire escapes and brick conditions and the degree of mortar that may be present in cornice conditions. Throw in smoke conditions, and now we can see that the elevated risks are going to be present. The importance of building construction can be related to a couple of simple terms here. Building construction is as fundamental to structural firefighting as water is to fire suppression. You can't get any simpler and straightforward than that. When we talk about our operations, it all goes back to understanding construction, understanding those features, and then truly the importance of water application that has to be simulated in a cohesive and seamless fashion that puts effective water without getting too overloaded on all the sometimes complexities of what the incident may be. So again, be the best that you can possibly be. Please let me know if there's anything I can help you out with relative to information. Again, our session was really a high-level review on insights, a lot of information, and we just really have run out of time. We've actually gone over a little bit on our time. And again, hopefully we've provided you with some insights to further your knowledge, skill, and ability development at the company command officer level, even at the firefighter level. Some tremendous great books out there. Send me an email. I'll send you my reading list on some books that I would recommend that are both fire and non-fire service related. My key takeaways on some line of duty deaths and near miss reports that are must reads for any of you that are out there. So again, I would encourage you to send me an email, drop me a phone call or text message. I'll do my best to help facilitate your need. So really want to thank the board and all of the committee members that were involved in allowing me to present here again at the 2021 Maryland State Firemen's Association's virtual convention and conference. And more importantly, I really look forward to the opportunity, if it's available, to see many of you hopefully next year in 2022, where we can do a more comprehensive face-to-face and engaging and interactive type program. So again, my appreciation to the entire board, convention committee, and for all of you to really take advantage of the virtual presentations here. A lot of great information that I saw on the agenda. And again, my thanks for you taking time to get into this particular topic area that's very, very important in today's built environment and today's demanding Fireground. So stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time around. Thanks again.
California Casualty has been endorsed by the MSFA for 10 years for its auto, home, and renter's insurance. It is our honor and privilege to protect those who protect our communities. Happy 10-year anniversary to the members of MSFA. Thank you for all that you do. For more information about our program, please visit www.calcash.com/MSFA. We look forward to seeing you at various local, county, and state events.